Hello and welcome back to another devlog on the things that I worked on about 2 weeks ago. For this week, I'm diving into two major topics in Unity that I haven't touched too much: mesh generation and editor tools. With these two topics, I'll be creating a speedy level editor. Apologies for the delay in episodes, by the way. I had volunteered for some overnight shifts at work for some extra money, and by the time I got home in the mornings, I was feeling like mush, and it's been throwing me off recently. Instead, I only did some studying and writing when I was feeling alright. Now onto LossC's level editor. There's 4 core aspects of the tool that I'll need to write: a data file for the level, a reader and writer, a mesh generator, and the editor tools that hooks everything together into a nice GUI in the scene view. I could add in a collider generator, but that'll come in next week since I've got a lot on my plate this week. Starting things off, I decided that the easiest way to experiment with building out meshes would be to have an image file to compare if things go wrong. Plus, I can load that pixel data into a 2D array by width and height to search for tiles. Unfortunately, saving out a texture to a file gets a little odd. You see, when you edit and apply changes to a texture's pixels, you're not changing the source file itself, but a copy of it that's loaded into RAM. So I'll need to bring in the file writing namespace to write that texture into memory as a PNG, and bring in the editor namespace for finding the exact file path for the level texture, with Unity's asset database. Another small problem popped up as well. When Unity reloaded its scripts, the level data would become null, requiring me to reread that file. I added in a little snippet of code to do a null check when the inspector gets drawn through onValidate. This runs for every inspector chain, so it's super handy for light editor customization. With that, 2 pillars of the tool is complete, and I think I'm ready for a little break. It's the tail end of Adventure Week in Pokemon Go, and I'd love to get some miles in to finally evolve my favorite Pokemon. I would say that scripting mesh generation looks like a daunting task at first, but when you break it down into its core components and rules, it eases up just a little bit. Oh, and by the way, I won't be covering everything about meshes, just the parts that I'll be needing to build out a level. Meshes at their simplest forms are just arrays of data that rely on one main array. An array of verts in the form of a vector 3 that describes the XYZ position of a point in space. The triangle array actually builds out the geometry in a set of 3 integers by references to the indices of the vert array. But order here matters for each set of 3. Triangles are defined in a clockwise order to face the camera. If they're in counterclockwise order, they'll be facing away from the camera and be skipped in rendering due to backface culling for optimization purposes. The first part of mesh generation will be the tops of the walls, which works out nicely in a grid form. With that in mind, we can use 2 for loops to set up our array of verts with proper offsetting. Then we'll be using this larger double for loop to write out each grid's cells on a 2x2 basis, covering 1 quad at a time. Surprisingly, things turned out way nicer than I expected. I even set it all up in a try-catch block in case things did go wrong at a certain point, but looks like that wasn't really needed. Since this is less of a tutorial series and more of a development blog, I'll leave some additional resources in the description if you'd like to learn more on this topic. Oh, and one more thing, this shouldn't be pink, but I selected the wrong shader on accident from the very beginning. I wasted more time on troubleshooting this online than I'd like to admit. Today I woke up at the nice time of 1 PM, and I've got a little less than 3 hours to squeeze in for game development, before needing to head out for some extra shifts at work. So let's see how far I can go with cutting holes into the mesh generator. To be honest, I thought that this was gonna be more than just an if statement from the grid position to a level data to decide on whether or not to skip rendering out a quad. But somehow this proved to be the most straightforward thing with this tool. Turns out it really was just going to be an if statement. To be honest, I planned for a lot more time on this than I just started on some quality of life improvements. But I did get a small bug where one triangle gets tossed out that I couldn't quite figure out. With that, this day is pretty much going to go entirely to working part-time and trying to get some much-needed rest. In Unity's documentation, they refer to the UI in the scene view as handles. This includes everything from the GUI from playback on particle systems to the arrows you use to move objects around. I think this is where Unity really shines for me. At least how I've always thought it would have been, since I haven't found a flexible purpose for diving into it. But now I do, and I'm pretty excited to dig into it. One of the first few things I programmed in was the debug modes to help this video out. With gizmos you can't write out text, but with handles you can write it in the scene, so I added in some text for vert and triangle IDs, and that's where it hit me, the reason for that missing triangle from the other day. When I'm tossing out triangles based on grid positions, I'm setting those triangle vert indices as 0, 0, 0, and I thought I was checking for 0, 0, 0 to toss them out, but really I'm only checking if one of those are 0, and there's only one triangle at the moment using vertex 0, and it's the messed up one, the very first triangle that gets generated. Returning back to handles, I got the functionality down to a basic form. At first I wanted smaller dots as buttons, but the invisible size kind of made it confusing. Instead I shifted to a traditional button with alpha controllers, but using this tool now is already way nicer than manually typing in 1s and 0s inside the inspector. Eventually I want to move all the controls into the scene view to max out efficiency, but that will also be for another time. For now I'm heading off to bed for an early morning shift. After work and a short nap, I was ready to go again at around 8 PM. I took like a 6-hour nap, so things are already looking weirder for my sleep schedule. But tonight's work, I'm digging in with pushing the level data and reader for getting it ready as a real level editor. Unfortunately, that's not how things turned out. Problems were popping off left and right that had me rethink how I wanted the tool to function. Resizing the level texture would resize differently every time, while sometimes it just didn't even resize. Pixel data would have their alpha channel damaged inconsistently, and the mesh wouldn't be offsetted correctly. And most of all, the editor tool itself was already lagging the editor at a 64 by 64 pixel level size. Definitely something that I'd get annoyed with in about a week. I made myself a marshmallow root tea to take me away from the keyboard to do some rethinking. When I got back, I made the call do instead of having a single level editor. I take a page out of Minecraft and treat them as multiple chunks, and edit them as such. This will take additional time since I'll need to create scripts to properly control all of these chunks, and to reconfigure the scripts that I already have. I fixed that offsetting problem though, fairly quickly. Turns out I hard-coded in the offsetting for a 4x4 texture size. If only every problem was this easy to solve. With some additional tidying up done, I might as well make the level mesh look more like a real level with adding in some walls. One of the things I'll need is a way to search the mesh for a specific type of edge, a boundary edge that doesn't share any edges with surrounding faces. But I found a tip on Stack Overflow during my midnight shifts, and it worked out first try. I added in a debug mode to preview these too before heading to bed for the night. With walls, it should have been easy to duplicate the border edges vertices twice. Once with their original positions and once for lowered positions. Then I can restitch those verts as tries. But in reality it turned like this. I tried to tinker with this bug for about an hour or so, but I wasn't really making much progress. I don't really know why this is happening. Instead I went with an alternate approach, where I instead created a new struct, a quad variable with a boundary edge struct as its input parameter. Then with a new function, I can take in the mesh's vert and triangle array as a reference, so I can add in the constructed quad one by one. And with that, the State of Velocity's level editor is in nice shape. There's still some things I want to improve on though, such as swapping nicely between different chunks, and maybe a rectangle tool to change the area quicker. And the ability to use the tool without ever leaving the scene view, of course. But this will be a nice stopping point for this week. Maybe you learned a thing or two this week like I did. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing, and with that, have a good one, and I'll see you in the next one.